My name, the one recorded on official documents, is Agnes Mayhew. To the majority of you who have gathered today, however, I was known by a simpler designation, a title that erased the individual and replaced it with a function. I was Grandma. For 75 years, my life was a quiet, sprawling epic of service. It was a fabric woven from the threads of unwavering support for my children, Carol, Richard, and David, and in due course, for their own children, my beloved grandchildren. The image, I suspect, forms in your minds without any need for artistic embellishment. The little old lady, a permanent fixture in the background of family photographs, forever doting on the young ones. The woman whose kitchen was a perpetual source of oatmeal cookies, their comforting, cinnamon-scented aroma a constant in a changing world. The woman who in later years would find money within her modest, carefully managed budget to provide the down payments for their first homes, an act they accepted as their natural due. My ears were repositories for their heartbreaks, my arms a ready sanctuary for their tears. I poured my soul, my very essence, into the foundation of this family, believing it to be a structure that would stand forever. My house, a small, unassuming bungalow on a street lined with equally unassuming houses in a quiet suburb, had always been that foundation's physical form. It was a sanctuary, a place where the abrasive worries of the outside world seemed to dissolve in the pervasive, comforting scent of freshly baked apple pie. Its walls, insulated with a half-century of memories, held the echoes of laughter that once ricocheted through its cozy, slightly cluttered rooms. This house was the silent, steadfast witness to so many fleeting moments, a keeper of forgotten time. It remembered the tentative, stumbling first steps of toddlers, their chubby hands gripping the edge of the coffee table. It remembered the awkward, fidgeting silence of teenage dates, the anxious young men and women sitting stiffly on the floral-patterned sofa under my gentle, watchful eye. It remembered the chaotic joy of holiday dinners where we squeezed together around a dining table extended with extra leaves, too many people for the space, but always, I believed, happy. I lived for these moments. I did not merely observe them. I invested myself in them, becoming a part of the mortar that held the bricks of their lives together. My hands now, they're a roadmap of my life's labors. The skin is thin, like parchment, and overlaid with a constellation of liver spots. The veins stand out in gnarled blue relief, and the knuckles are swollen with the dull, persistent ache of arthritis. Faint silvery scars, almost imperceptible, mark the countless minor injuries from kitchen knives, rose thorns, and broken glass. But these hands were not always so. Once, they were tireless engines of creation and care. They knitted soft woolen blankets for newborn grandchildren, each stitch a tiny whispered prayer for their warmth and safety. They lovingly tended to my rose garden, a source of quiet pride, where each budding flower was a small, perfect secret unfolding in the morning sun. I knew each bush by name, the deep crimson of Mr. Lincoln, the delicate blush of Queen Elizabeth, the creamy white of peace. The work was cyclical. A slow dance with the seasons, the pruning in late winter, the feeding in spring, the constant vigilant war against the insidious black spot and the tiny green aphids. And of course, these hands prepared an innumerable tally of meals, thousands upon thousands of them, which I believed nourished not just the body, but the very soul of my family. My eyes, though now framed by a delicate, intricate web of wrinkles, still held, I thought, that spark of fierce, unwavering love that had always been my defining characteristic. I weathered the storms of life, the financial worries, the childhood illnesses, the marital spats of my children, with a quiet, uncomplaining resilience, always placing the needs and wants of my loved ones before my own. This was never a burden. It was my calling, the central purpose of my existence. But time, the indifferent accountant, always collects its due. The process was gradual, insidious. It began as a persistent low-grade ache in my joints, a dull throb that I dismissed as a natural consequence of age and the damp weather that often settled over our town. It was a background noise to which I adapted a new, unwelcome rhythm in the symphony of my body. Then came the slowing of my once energetic pace. The simple act of bending down to weed the garden became a calculated effort, requiring a hand braced against my knee. The climb up the stairs to the second floor, once an unconscious act, transformed into a journey, requiring a deliberate pause on the landing to catch my breath. I was a clock winding down, the ticks growing slower, more labored. The turning point, the moment that cleaved my life into a before and an after, was a fall. It happened last autumn in the garden I loved. It was not a dramatic event, but a simple, mundane moment of inattention. My foot, clad in its worn gardening clog, caught on an exposed tree root, a gnarled knuckle of wood protruding from the earth. There was a brief, disorienting sensation of weightlessness, a fleeting view of the gray, overcast sky, and then the hard, unyielding impact with the ground. I heard more than felt a dull, sickening crack from my hip. The pain that followed was a white-hot, blinding wave. And so it was that I, Agnes Mayhew, a woman who had been in constant, purposeful motion for her entire life, found myself confined to a wheelchair. My independence, the possession I cherished above all others, had been cruelly and irrevocably snatched away. The initial outpouring of concern from my family was a comforting balm. It was a familiar sensation, the warmth of their attention, a reassurance against the cold fear that had begun to creep into my heart. My 3 children, Carol, my eldest, ever the pragmatist, organizing schedules and consulting with doctors with brisk efficiency, Richard, perpetually busy with his big projects and vague business ventures, and David, the youngest, whose life was a perpetual whirlwind of personal dramas and romantic entanglements, visited frequently in those first weeks. Their faces, arranged in expressions of what appeared to be genuine sympathy, surrounded my hospital bed. My 5 grandchildren sent cards adorned with glitter and awkwardly drawn flowers, their youthful, vibrant energy a brief, bright contrast to the sterile stillness that had settled over my life. They chattered about their studies, their friends, their plans for the future, and for a few precious moments, I could almost forget the dull, constant ache in my hip and the dead weight of my legs. As the weeks bled into months, however, the predictable erosion began. The visits dwindled. The tapestry of their concern began to fray. Carol, navigating the demands of a high-pressure career and her own growing family, found it progressively harder to make the hour-long trip across town. Her excuses, delivered over the phone, became more elaborate, her voice tinged with a weariness that seemed to blame me for its very existence. Richard, who had always possessed a talent for evasion, cited nebulous work pressures and financial constraints, a narrative contradicted by the new, gleaming SUV I knew was parked in his driveway. David, the most restless of my children, became an increasingly rare presence, his promises to visit dissolving into the ether like morning fog. The practical burden of my care, initially shared amongst them in a flurry of familial duty, was gradually and quietly outsourced. It fell to a rotating roster of part-time aides sourced from an agency. These women, mostly young and preoccupied with the vibrant tapestry of their own lives, moved through my house with an air of detached professionalism. They seemed more focused on the glowing screens of their phones than on the needs of the silent woman in the wheelchair. They performed their duties, the bathing, the dressing, the meal preparation, with a mechanical competence devoid of warmth, of a gentle touch, of a simple kind word that might have eased the suffocating weight of loneliness. My house, once a vessel filled with the warmth and noise of family, now echoed with a sterile, profound silence, punctuated only by the faint, electric whir of my wheelchair and the impersonal, canned chatter of daytime television. Loneliness became my constant companion. It was not a feeling, but a physical presence, a heavy cloak that settled over my shoulders each morning and grew heavier with each passing, silent day. I would spend hours sitting by the large picture window in the living room, a sentinel watching a world from which I was now excluded. I watched the neighborhood children play outside, their laughter and shouts drifting through the closed glass, stirring a wistful, painful ache in my heart for the days when my own grandchildren had filled my yard with their joyful noise. I saw their faces in those of the playing children. I heard their long-ago laughter now just a faint, mocking echo in the vast empty halls of my memory. On one particularly bleak afternoon, with a cold spring rain drumming a monotonous, dreary rhythm against my bedroom window, Carol arrived. Her visit was brief and possessed a strange, unsettlingly businesslike quality. She did not bother with the usual pleasantries about my health or the weather. She went straight to the point, not even taking a seat, standing at the foot of my bed as if I were not her mother, but an agenda item on her schedule, a problem to be solved. She began to speak of the increasing financial burden of my care. The words came out in a smooth, rehearsed flow, the ever-rising bills for the home aides, the logistical difficulties of coordinating their constantly shifting schedules, the strain it was putting on the family. She spoke of the strain on her family, the implication clear and sharp as a shard of glass. I was the source of the strain. The words, though delivered with a thin veneer of feigned concern, felt cold and clinical, stripping away any lingering foolish hope I still harbored for a return to the closeness we once shared. This was not a conversation about my feelings or my well-being. It was a financial report, and I was the primary liability. Then came the suggestion, the purpose of her visit. It was delivered with a practiced reluctance that I saw through instantly. She spoke of a wonderful assisted living facility she had found. Her voice adopted a falsely cheerful, saleswoman-like tone as she explained how I would receive round-the-clock professional care and have plenty of opportunities for social interaction. The smile on her face was tight and strained, a painful caricature of warmth. The true meaning of her words hung heavy and suffocating in the air between us. I was becoming too much of a burden, too expensive, too complicated to have around. There was no longer a place for me in the neat, busy architecture of their lives. The move was executed with swift, impersonal efficiency. My belongings, the physical artifacts of a life lived over 7 decades, were packed by strangers. Young people in uniforms from a moving company, they showed no reverence for my memories, handling my cherished possessions with a careless indifference that felt like a violation. My beloved furniture, each piece holding a story, was sold or given away without my input, without a single question directed at me. My hand-knitted shawl, which had always lain on the back of my favorite armchair, my old porcelain tea set, saved for special occasions that had never quite materialized, the framed photographs of my children and grandchildren that had smiled down at me from every surface, all gone. I was simply transported, like an inanimate object, a piece of inconvenient luggage, to a sterile, anonymous room in the assisted living facility. The walls were painted a bland, institutional beige, a color devoid of personality or warmth. The floor was a scuffed beige linoleum. The single window looked out onto a brick wall and a row of dumpsters. There was no photograph of mine on the wall, no piece of my own embroidery, not even the lingering scent of my roses. The cheerful, forced chatter of the other residents in the common areas seemed distant and alien. The sound of another world to which I did not belong. I was alone, truly and profoundly alone, in a way I had never before imagined possible. In the sterile, humming quiet of my new surroundings, a cold, hard seed of resentment began to sprout in the barren soil of my heart. The years of selfless giving, the sacrifices I had made without a second thought, the unconditional love I had poured out like water into a bottomless well, it all seemed to have been forgotten. It had been dismissed as easily and casually as clearing a forgotten dish from the dinner table. It was not just neglect. It was an erasure. An erasure of my value, of my role, of my very identity within the family I had built. This feeling festered, a slow-burning, smokeless fire growing stronger with each passing, identical day. The deep sadness I had initially felt began to curdle, transforming into something harder, sharper, a burning sense of injustice, a deep, foundational ache of betrayal. The family to which I had dedicated my life had cast me aside, not out of dire necessity or a tragic circumstance, but out of simple, stark convenience. I had ceased to be useful in the accustomed sense, and so I had been discarded. One sleepless night, the 3rd or 4th in a row, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The fluorescent lights in the hallway outside my door hummed their monotonous electronic song. Their cold, indifferent light seeping through the crack beneath the door, illuminating my thoughts. Lying in that strange, narrow bed, in that strange, empty room, I made a decision. A new clarity, cold and sharp, cut through the fog of my grief. The years of being the selfless matriarch, the ever-giving, ever-forgiving grandma, were over. A new chapter was beginning, one in which I would, for the first time in my life, put myself first. And if that meant a small, quiet reckoning along the way, then so be it. My heart, once soft and pliable as rising dough, now seemed to have been forged from steel. The next morning, as the first faint gray rays of dawn pierced through the cheap vinyl blinds of my window, I requested a meeting with the facility's administrator. Her name was Mrs. Davidson, a kind but clearly overworked woman with weary eyes and a permanently strained smile. I spoke calmly, with a firmness that surprised even myself, inquiring about my legal options and the procedure for updating my last will and testament. Mrs. Davidson, accustomed to the complaints and requests of the residents, patiently explained the entire process, providing me with the name of a local lawyer who made visits to the facility. I listened intently, my mind already formulating a plan, each step carefully considered, a new and unfamiliar sensation of cold purpose spreading through me. A few days later, the lawyer, a Mr. Abernathy, arrived. He was a man known for his discretion and meticulous attention to detail, and more importantly, for not asking unnecessary questions. I felt, to my own surprise, remarkably confident. My gnarled, arthritic hands rested on the arms of my wheelchair with a surprising steadiness. I laid out my wishes to him in a clear, unwavering voice. I wanted to completely rewrite my will. Mr. Abernathy listened without judgment, his gold-nibbed pen scratching quietly against the thick paper of his legal pad. He noted my instructions, occasionally asking a clarifying question about legal phrasing, but never attempting to pry into my motives. He seemed to sense a deep-seated, immovable resolve in his elderly client and respected her right to silence. The process took several weeks. It became the new focus of my days. I meticulously reviewed each draft of the document that Mr. Abernathy sent over, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon with a newfound intense focus. I made several amendments, each one a small, deliberate step in my evolving plan. With each signature I placed on the preliminary documents, I felt a surge of power, a sense of control returning to me. It was a sensation I had not felt in a very long time, and I found that I liked it. Throughout this period, my family remained largely absent, their silence a confirming echo of my decision. A brief, perfunctory phone call from Richard on my birthday was the only contact I had. He sounded distracted, eager to get off the line. His hollow, rushed well wishes only served to solidify my resolve. They would learn that Agnes Mayhew was not a person to be so easily dismissed and forgotten. They would learn that beneath the frail, compliant exterior they had so carelessly warehoused, something else entirely could be hidden. Finally, the day came when the new will was finalized. It was signed, witnessed by Mrs. Davidson and a nurse, notarized, and now legally binding. I felt a quiet, profound satisfaction, a small but firm surge of control returning to my life. I was once again the master of my own destiny, a sovereign of my own small, quiet kingdom. The contents of the will remained my secret, a document locked away in Mr. Abernathy's safe, its potential held in reserve. It was my ace in the hole, an unplayed card that no one else knew I held. Life in the assisted living facility settled into its predictable, monotonous routine. I participated in the scheduled activities with a placid, compliant demeanor. I sat through the morning chair exercises, the endless, mind-numbing games of bingo, the afternoon screenings of old black and white movies I had seen 100 times before. I made polite, surface-level conversation with the other residents, women much like myself, forgotten relics of families who had moved on. I endured the often patronizing cheerfulness of the staff, their smiles and words as mechanical and prepackaged as the bland food they served 3 times a day. But beneath this placid surface, beneath the mask of quiet compliance, a subtle but profound shift had occurred. The former Agnes, the gentle, ever-giving, soft-hearted woman, was gone. Her place had been taken by a woman with a core of steel and a carefully guarded secret. I was no longer soft clay to be molded by the hands of others. I began to pay closer attention to my finances. The monthly bank statements and investment portfolio reports, which used to be unceremoniously piled up on my dresser, were now meticulously examined. For decades, I had practiced a quiet, unassuming frugality. While my children saw only a woman who scrimped and saved, I had been methodically and intelligently investing. A small inheritance from my own mother in the 1970s, a few well-chosen stocks bought on a whim after overhearing a tip, years of diverting small amounts from my husband's pension into mutual funds. It had all been managed quietly, without fanfare. Over 50 years, these small streams had converged into a substantial river. The result was a fortune far greater than my family could have ever imagined. I had always lived simply, my focus on providing for their wants rather than indulging in any luxuries for myself. Every saved penny, every shrewdly purchased stock was a brick in the invisible financial empire I had built. No one, absolutely no one, suspected its existence. The full realization of my own financial independence, confirmed by the stark black and white of the financial statements, brought a quiet, barely perceptible smile to my lips. They thought I was a helpless old woman, a financial drain, entirely dependent on their grudging charity. They believed I was just another useless burden to be managed and eventually written off. In reality, they were the ones who were in for a rude awakening. This knowledge was a warm secret blanket on a cold night. As the months passed, I began to subtly, almost imperceptibly, widen the distance between myself and my family. When they called, and the calls grew rarer and rarer, I did not always return them immediately. My answers to their perfunctory questions about my health became brief and non-committal. I offered no explanations for my newfound brevity, no apologies. I simply created a space between us, a quiet, echoing void that mirrored the emotional chasm they had created first. When Carol complained about being busy, her voice frayed with self-imposed stress, I would simply reply, "I understand." My tone flat and devoid of any trace of sympathy. The holidays approached, a time of year that I had once orchestrated with the precision and passion of a symphony conductor. My house had always been the festive heart of the family, filled with the scent of pine needles and gingerbread, the sound of carols and laughter. This year I made no effort. When Carol called to inquire about my Christmas plans, a slight annoyance in her voice as she tried to arrange her own family schedule, I simply stated calmly that I would be staying at the facility. The surprised disappointment in her voice was palpable, almost tangible through the phone line, but I felt nothing. No guilt, no regret, not even a fleeting wisp of sadness, only emptiness. The day of reckoning was drawing nearer, though my family remained blissfully, arrogantly unaware. I continued my quiet routine, a ghost in the machine of the facility. The secret of my altered will and my substantial fortune was a silent, coiled power I now possessed. I knew the time would come when they would be forced to realize the enormity of their mistake, the profound depth of their callousness. And when that day arrived, Agnes Mayhew would be ready. The long, thankless years of being the unseen, unappreciated cornerstone of their lives were finally over. The game, I knew, was far from over, and I awaited the final play with a cold, patient calm. The day I had been waiting for arrived. Not with eagerness, no, but rather with a sense of inevitability, much like how autumn succeeds summer. This was the day when the final, carefully crafted piece of my plan would fall into place. I knew I would catch them completely off guard. This was not a cry for help that they ignored, nor tears they failed to wipe away. This was a quiet, methodical strike they never expected. My health, as anticipated, had continued its slow, steady decline. This wasn't a deception. I simply allowed nature to take its course, refusing certain interventions, embracing the passive descent. My growing silence and frailty only reinforced their perception of me as a weak, decrepit old woman on the verge of senility. They saw only the fading shell, never noticing the sharp mind that still worked like a well-oiled machine within. On one ordinary Thursday, my children were summoned. Carol, Richard, and even the elusive David were invited by Mr. Abernathy to a very important family meeting regarding my estate. They arrived at the lawyer's downtown office with expressions of mild annoyance, viewing it as another tedious obligation. I imagine they expected another discussion about the mounting costs of my care, or perhaps some legal formality related to the future sale of my small house, a property they had already mentally sold and divided the proceeds of. They sat in the plush, uncomfortable chairs in the conference room, their faces a mixture of boredom and impatience. Mr. Abernathy, as always, was impeccably professional. He spoke in a low, even tone, explaining the procedure for the meeting. I sat beside him at the head of the long, polished table, my wheelchair a silent, metallic throne. I kept my eyes closed, feigning exhaustion, a tactic I had perfected over the past year. No one paid me much attention. Their eyes were fixed on the lawyer. So Mr. Abernathy began, turning the first page of a thick, bound document before him. As you know, he stated, I, Agnes Mayhew, recently made significant changes to my last will and testament, and in accordance with my instructions, we are gathered today to read it. A slight flicker of surprise mixed with irritation crossed my children's faces. Changes? Carol repeated, her brows slightly furrowed. But Mom never said anything. She had every right to do so, Mr. Abernathy replied politely, his gaze remaining on the document. And this will, dated 6 months ago, is her final and legally binding testament. Please pay attention. He began to read. First came the dry legal formalities. He mentioned my modest state pension, a small checking account designated to cover my funeral expenses. I could feel the tension in the room relax. This was what they expected. They were probably already mentally divesting my old tea set. Then Mr. Abernathy paused. He looked at them over the top of his reading glasses, and I, from behind my closed eyelids, could sense the shift in the room's atmosphere. I detected a tiny, almost imperceptible glint of satisfaction in his usually calm eyes. And now, he continued, his voice dropping slightly, we move to the main portion of the estate. I, Agnes Mayhew, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath. He began to name assets. He spoke of investment portfolios with established brokerage firms they had never heard of. He spoke of stock holdings in major blue-chip companies, names they recognized from the news. He spoke of municipal bonds and 2 small rental properties in a neighboring state, properties whose existence was a complete secret. The figures he quoted were staggering. With each mention of a 6-figure sum, an audible gasp or a sharp intake of breath rippled through the room, each sound quickly suppressed, replaced by a stunned, disbelieving silence. Their faces, oh, I wish I could have painted them. Even with my eyes closed, I could picture them perfectly. Carol's mouth had fallen slightly open, her usual composure completely shattered. Richard, I knew, would have turned a blotchy, apoplectic red, his eyes bulging in shock. David, who had been slumping in his chair with boredom, would be sitting bolt upright, staring blankly ahead. Millions of dollars, Mr. Abernathy continued in an even voice, not hundreds of thousands, millions. The total taxable estate belonging to me, Agnes Mayhew, amounts to $8,743,200.40. The room fell into a deathly, profound silence. It was a silence so absolute that I could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. It was the sound of their shock, their greed, their utter disbelief. But this is impossible, Carol finally whispered, her voice weak and trembling, a mere thread of sound. Mom, she always said she barely made ends meet. She used coupons. Indeed, Mr. Abernathy said, and this time I was certain I detected a slight, almost imperceptible smirk in his voice. I was always very frugal and remarkably far-sighted in my investments. I preferred to maintain my privacy on the matter. Then he moved to the core of it, to the very heart of the reason we were all gathered in that room. He turned another page. According to my will, he continued, the entire sum of $8,743,200.40 is to be bequeathed to a collection of charitable organizations. Specifically, 50% to a foundation that assists the elderly living in poverty and combating loneliness, and 50% to programs that support young military veterans so that they may never have to experience abandonment after their service. I felt their eyes turn to me. Even with my eyelids shut, I could feel the intense, burning heat of their stares. I pictured their faces, shock, turning to confusion, then to dawning, horrified realization, and finally to pure, unadulterated fury. Furthermore, Mr. Abernathy added, and his voice now held the solemn finality of a judge delivering a sentence, "I have left each of you, my children, Carol, Richard, and David, the sum of $1 as a token of your being mentioned in the will, and to prevent any legal contest." This was my final, most subtle, most painful jab. $1, a symbol of their complete and utter disregard, a monetary valuation of their abandonment. The silence that followed this pronouncement was far louder than any scream. I knew in that moment that they finally understood. They understood what they had lost. They understood that their mother, whom they considered a burden, was actually a hidden treasure they had carelessly, thoughtlessly thrown away. I opened my eyes. Their faces were contorted masks of rage, resentment, and a raw, gaping sense of betrayal. All the emotions I had silently endured in my beige room were now reflected back at me from their faces. And in that moment, looking at them, I felt neither triumph nor schadenfreude, only a deep, all-encompassing calm. Justice had been served. My revenge was not cruel. It was merely a mirror reflecting their own actions back at them with perfect, crystalline clarity. I quietly pressed the button on the control stick of my wheelchair. With a soft whir, I began to move away from the table where my children sat, frozen in their shock. They started to speak, to sputter, but the words caught in their throats, strangled by the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. Their eyes, once so indifferent, were now filled with a terrible, belated understanding, the understanding of a lost fortune, and perhaps more importantly, a lost mother whom they had so easily, so conveniently written off. I rolled out of the office, leaving them to deal with the consequences of their own decisions. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, cutting off the sounds of their brewing discontent. Outside the lawyer's office, in the marble-floored lobby, the world continued on its axis. The sun was shining through the tall windows, and I, Agnes Mayhew, finally felt truly free. My story didn't end as they had written it. It ended on my terms.